On 13 November 1974, in Amityville, a small town in New York, a 23-year-old man by the name of Ronald J. DeFeo Jr. murdered 6 members of his family with a rifle while they were sleeping in their beds at night. He killed his parents along with his young brothers and sisters. After killing his family, he ran to the nearest bar and shouted that someone shot his family. He said that he found their bodies after the murders and blamed it on a hitman. But the next day, he confessed his sins and admitted that he killed them. The DeFeos appeared to live happy lives on Long Island during the early 1970s. The family was comprised of Ronald DeFeo Sr. and Louise DeFeo and their 5 children, Ronald Jr., Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John Matthew. They lived in an affluent part of Long Island called Amityville. Their Dutch Colonial home had a swimming pool and a nearby boat dock. Inside the house, there were life-size portraits of the family hung on the walls. It seemed as if the family were kind, loving people. But the DeFeos were a very different family behind closed doors. Ronald DeFeo Sr. managed an auto dealership, a job that certainly couldn't support the family's lavish lifestyle. Instead, much of their money came from Louise's father, Michael Briganti, who purchased the family's home for them, allowing them to move out of their small Brooklyn apartment. Briganti later gave his son-in-law about $50,000 to have the family portraits painted. So, for all of the wealth and luxury that Ronald Big Ronnie DeFeo Sr. showed off, he had, in truth, earned very little of it himself. Big Ronnie was also reportedly an abusive and violent man. Most often, he took his anger and frustration out on his eldest child, Ronald DeFeo Jr., who usually went by Butch. And as Butch grew up, he struggled to find any common ground with his father. Butch was also bullied at school for being overweight, with kids calling him names like Porkchop and the Blob. By his teenage years, he had lost most of that weight through his use of amphetamines, which he had come to rely on, along with alcohol as a coping mechanism. He and his father continued to fight frequently. Butch once pulled a gun on Ronald Sr., and although Butch was technically employed at his family's dealership, he rarely showed up to work and left early when he did. In general, he spent most of his time doing drugs or drinking, getting into fights, and arguing with his parents. Butch's ongoing conflict with his father came to a violent head when he fatally shot Ronald DeFeo Sr. with a .35 caliber Marlin rifle as he slept during the early hours of November 13, 1974. But of course, he didn't just kill his father. He also turned the gun on his mother, Louise DeFeo. Then, 23-year-old Butch went into the bedrooms where his siblings were sleeping and murdered 18-year-old Dawn, 13-year-old Allison, 12-year-old Mark, and 9-year-old John Matthew with the same weapon. After killing his family, Butch took a shower, got dressed, and collected incriminating evidence. On his way to work, he threw the evidence, including the gun, into a storm drain. Then, he went about his day. As the day went on, he decided to leave work and spend the afternoon with his friends, making sure to mention to all of them that he couldn't get in touch with his family for some reason. In the early evening, Butch ran to a nearby bar, screaming for help, told the patrons there that someone had shot his family, and begged them to come back with him to his house.
He opened the door, and he was screaming, "Come on, help me, somebody shot my mother and father." And everyone ran out of the bar, and that was it. They all took off. No, I had to stay, I was tending bar. They all jumped in his car and took off.
There, the shocked bargoers were greeted by a truly horrific scene. Each member of the DeFeo family was found lying face down in bed, with fatal bullet wounds. Ronald DeFeo Sr. and Louise DeFeo had both been shot twice, and their children had been shot one time each. Police arrived at the scene and found an in-shock Ronald DeFeo Jr. waiting for them. DeFeo initially claimed to the authorities that he believed his family had been targeted by the mob. At first, it seemed like the cops might buy his story. They even took him to a police station for his protection, but they soon noticed details that didn't line up. DeFeo maintained that he had been at work all morning and with friends all afternoon. Therefore, he couldn't have killed his family. But police quickly determined that the bodies had been shot sometime in the early morning, well before DeFeo would have gone to work. By the next day, Ronald DeFeo Jr. had confessed to the crime. He told the police, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." Ultimately, DeFeo was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder in November. He would later be sentenced to 6 consecutive sentences of 25 years to life in prison. But the story of the Amityville murders was not over. For one thing, there were still mysteries surrounding the case. Authorities had no idea how all 6 victims had died in their sleep without a struggle. Another thing that puzzled them was that none of the neighbors had heard gunshots, despite the fact that DeFeo did not use a gun silencer. Though DeFeo claimed to have drugged his family's dinner, experts noted that a long time had passed between the meal and the family's deaths. Perhaps most chillingly, the killer's motive remained uncertain. Though it's clear that DeFeo had many issues with his father, it baffled many that he would go after the rest of his family members, especially his youngest siblings. And considering the fact that DeFeo would change his story multiple times in prison, he shed very little light on the haunting mystery. In December 1975, a new family moved into the DeFeo's old home. George Lutz, his wife Kathy, and their 3 children. The day they moved, the couple had a priest bless the house. But George claimed the holy man felt an unseen hand slap him in the sewing room and heard a voice say, "Get out."
And I heard a rather deep voice behind me say, "Get out." It seemed so directed toward me that I was really quite startled. I felt a slap at one point on the face. I felt somebody slap me, and there was nobody there.
Soon after, the couple said they began noticing odd things around the house, such as doors being ripped from hinges, cabinets slamming shut, and slime oozing from the ceilings. He claimed that he would mysteriously wake up at 3:15 a.m. nearly every day, around the same time the DeFeo murders were believed to have happened. At times, his wife was physically transformed into an old woman and once levitated, George said. One night, he heard his children's beds slamming up and down on the floor, but claimed he couldn't do anything because an invisible force was paralyzing him. The family moved out after 28 days, reportedly leaving their possessions behind, including clothes in their closets and food in the fridge.
By the last week we were there, it was nightly occurrences of noises, the things like odors coming and going, or Kathy being touched from behind by some unseen person, or Missy talking to herself and asking questions like Jody telling us about her imaginary friend that wasn't so imaginary, it turns out.
Yeah, she claimed to have an imaginary friend, right?
Yes, and she would come and ask Kathy questions like, do angels talk? And
really,
Jody is the name of the angel, and Jody is telling Missy that we're going to live there forever.
Forever.
Strange things. It's kind of off-putting. Our dog Harry would not go in that room that Mary was talking about earlier. The last night we were in the house was the reason not to stay there anymore. And when we called Father Ray the next day, he asked what we were still doing there. He was surprised that we were still even in the house, and it hadn't even occurred to us to, even at that point, to just up and abandon everything and get in the van and leave. That night, Kathy had levitated and moved away from me on the bed.
No, wait a minute. Slow up right there.
Sure.
Kathy levitated.
Yes.
Now, you were both in bed?
Yes.
And you were both awake or both asleep or at the time, or what?
Kathy was asleep. She was asleep. And she lifted up off the bed and went towards the wall away from me.
Huh.
This is after she had turned into an old crone, a really ugly old woman that literally took hours and hours for it to go away.
In front of your face?
Yes, and then later she did that again at her mom's house after we moved out of the house and moved in with her mom.
Oh, my God. You're sitting there watching your wife, and she turns and, like the picture of Dorian Gray, she almost instantly becomes an old woman?
Yes.
And then that effect remains for hours?
Yeah, one time it was longer than just a few hours.
5 months after the Lutz family left, Ed and Lorraine arrived at the home to conduct an investigation into what had tormented the family. According to the Warrens' case files, Ed was physically pushed to the ground, and Lorraine felt a deep sense of something demonic in the home and was overcome with visions of the DeFeo family bodies laying on the floor. The Warrens also captured a photo of a demon child standing in the home's basement.
So we went to the Amityville home. We met Marvin Scott with a camera crew. And we were supposed to meet George Lutz, who was going to let us in the house. But George wasn't there. And he made a phone call. And George Lutz said, "The closest I'll come to that house is 4 blocks away. I'll give you the keys at a pizza parlor nearby." Well, we went there. We met George. He gave us the keys. And I'll never forget it. He was sitting as close to me as you are. And I said, remember now, this is the first time I've ever seen the guy. "Mr. Lutz, what happened to you in that house?" Because I really didn't know what happened. And he just looked at me and he said, "You know," just like that. I said, "No, I don't know." And I said, "What happened to you in the house that you were so frightened that your family and yourself fled out of there?"
Mm-hmm.
"You know."
That's all
now I
he
was getting
kept
a little
saying.
sick of this. I said, "I don't know. I'm not a clairvoyant. I'm not a medium. I'm an investigator." And I thought to myself, this guy doesn't even want to talk about it. Is he that scared of it? Well, I found out that he was afraid to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't want to give a recognition.
Right.
Well, we took the keys. We went to the house. Now, as I just said, I'm not a clairvoyant. I'm not a sensitive. But when I opened up that door and walked in that house, it reeked of death. Not just because of the 6 people who were murdered, the DeFeos, mother, father, 2 sisters, and 2 brothers. And this all occurred on November 13th, 1974, at 3:15 in the morning. Every member of the family was found shot to death, all lying on their stomach, Tony. Now, we'll get into that during the program, but that in itself was unnatural. The police had felt they were drugged. They were not drugged, and they found that out during the autopsy.
Mm-hmm.
We walked into that house, and it's my custom, Tony, to go down into the cellar, the lowest part of the house. These are usually the darkest areas. This is where evil thrives. This is where it survives. It hates God's light. It hates the sunlight. It hates any kind of light. So while Lorraine was walking up the stairs with the camera crew, I went down into the cellar. It was a huge place. We'll show pictures of it later. And as is my custom as a religious demonologist, I took out a crucifix, I held it up, and I commanded in the name of Jesus Christ and the blood of Christ what was there to reveal itself. It wasted no time. I never had such a quick reaction, Tony. I felt as though I was underneath a waterfall. That's how terrific the pressure was on my head and shoulders, forcing me down to the floor. Then I felt what I can only describe as hundreds of pinpoints of electricity hitting my body. And as though somebody had taken a hot towel and dropped it over my face, I couldn't breathe. I knew what was happening immediately. I felt it before, but not to that extent.
Mm-hmm.
I immediately went into what we call religious resistance, which means that I again commanded in the name of Jesus Christ, the blood of Christ, what was there, to leave and go back to where it came from. Immediately it lifted off. I went up the stairs to where Lorraine and the camera crew were, and she'll tell you what she felt there.
Well, now, I had no way of knowing, Tony, since I was they asked me to go up onto the next floor.
Mm-hmm.
I had just left walking all around on the first floor. And it's in that one room, that wet bar room, the room that you see on the very front of the house, that I stood and could see all of these bodies all lined up.
Clear visually.
Clear visually, I could see that. That's where the DeFeos were prior to being taken out, you know, to the morgue. And that was horribly disturbing. And I remember I took that relic, a Padre Pio, which no camera person knew I had, and I cupped it in my hands and I prayed, you know, to him.
Right.
Now that is the room where the image of him, Padre Pio, it was picked up on film.
We probably have a slide of this.
Yeah, we're going to have a slide of it, Tom. Now at this point, I'm still on camera, so I'm not looking. I just think Ed is with me, that he is somehow behind the cameras and that he is there. And I start to go up the stairs. Never did I know that he went downstairs. I did not know that. I started to go up to the first landing where the great big window is. And as I did, it felt as if I was standing right under onrushing water. And it bothers you. It's a pressure that's on your body to such a great extent.
What happens is that the atmosphere actually solidifies in homes like this. It's like trying to penetrate a wall of cement, really.
So I got up, I made it up to that landing, and again, I cupped that relic of Padre Pio and asked for his help, his guidance, and made it up the rest of the way. When I got up to the top of the stairs, remember, I'd never been in this home. I knew nothing about anything about it, nothing about the history at all, Tony. It was just another haunted house, except that we were on camera. I went to the left and went in this room. That was the sewing room.
Right.
And in that room, I looked at Marvin Scott, and he told me just a year ago that he will never forget what I said to him, and that is, I hope this is as close to hell as I'll ever get.
Wow.
And in that room is where Father Pecoraro was told by an unseen voice to get out. It's the room where the hundreds of flies were killed. That's all.
He was also slapped in the face at that time.
Yes.
Which a lot of people don't know. They think that the voice was the only thing he heard. After he heard the voice, he felt a physical slap in the face. He told me this himself.
This was the experience of Ed and Lorraine Warren in Amityville House. The Amityville murders will always remain one of the most haunted, unsolved mystery. We still don't know why Ronald DeFeo Jr. killed his family. What do you guys think about this story? Tell us in the comments, and we will see you in the next mysterious revelation. Don't forget to like and subscribe.